Maybe energy conservation isn't enough. What if global warming is already an unstoppable force? Is economic collapse one of our only hopes? These disturbing questions arise in a controversial study by Tim Garrett, an associate professor of atmospheric sciences at the University of Utah. Tim, welcome to Radio Ecoshock.
Hello.
Hi. Well, can you give us the title of your new paper and where people can find it?
The title of the paper is, Are There Basic Physical Constraints on Carbon Dioxide Emissions? And the article can be found on my website, perhaps most easily, which is easily found by either Googling Tim Garrett or going to the Atmospheric Sciences page at the University of Utah, or it can be found through the journal Climatic Change.
Okay, and I'll toss in a link to your webpage in my blog for this program. Well, look, I understand you applied some basic physics to the way our civilization works. Can you explain your theory for us?
Sure. I think the concept is easily understood in the light of perhaps looking at a growing child. And this is a familiar analogy, perhaps a good place to start, because if we think about a growing child consumes energy, as does an adult, in order to maintain daily operations of that child. But what is a bit different with a child is that as the child uses the energy, it uses energy not only to maintain its current size, but also uses some fraction of that energy in order to grow its current size. And if it does that efficiently, then it is able to grow faster and thereby consume more energy rather than less energy in the future. And it's a very simple physical concept. It can be written down with basic thermodynamic arguments using equations. But as I showed, it can also be applied to civilization as a whole, treating civilization as being an energy-consuming organism. And if that is done, then it turns out that there is a very simple relationship between the rate of energy consumption by civilization as a whole and its economic value. It turns out that money is power, where power is the rate of energy consumption. There is a simple relationship of about 10 milliwatts per inflation-adjusted $1990. And that's really the key result, I think, that leads to the other results that I found in the paper.
And one of those was a suggestion that alternative energy like solar may not actually help stop climate change. And I've heard those doubts from other scientists and from an economist like Britain's Tim Jackson. So growth, even green technology, could just mean more energy is consumed. Is that right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the green technology, I think, is a slightly separate issue from the growth itself. The society will consume energy and probably try to maximize its growth regardless, whether it's green technology or not green technology. Perhaps the difference between green technologies and other types is that some of these green technologies aren't associated with carbon dioxide emissions. But as I pointed out, in order just to stabilize carbon dioxide emissions, the switch to non-CO2 emitting power sources would have to be very rapid, about 2.2% per year. So that works out to, just as an easy metric, one nuclear power plant per day.
Wow. Well, I don't think we're about to build a nuclear power plant per day, so we'll get in just a few minutes, I think, to what the other alternative could be. But I wanted first to raise the question, to everyone's surprise, you've said that we don't even need to calculate population growth or even the spread of higher living standards to know how things will go, that this energy is the key factor. That seems a bit hard to believe.
Yeah, it might seem hard to believe, but I mean, it's not that standard of living and population aren't part of the energy consumption by civilization. Obviously, people consume energy in commensurate to their standard of living. But the point is that our standard of living and how many people there are on the planet is really just a consequence of past energy efficiency. So to think about it another way, coming back to the growing child, I don't need to think about the cells, the number of cells in the child, or how much energy each cell consumes to know that the child will grow. And I can look at how much energy the child is consuming to get an idea of how fast a child will continue to grow. I don't need to know the details.
You've also described civilization as a heat engine. Could you enlarge on that?
Well, I think that's the basic idea. A heat engine is, well, it's a very familiar concept in thermodynamics or in physics. Everyone learns about it in their physics degree, if that's the path they take. And normally a heat engine the idea was first coined in the 1800s when people were thinking about digging up coal or whatever it was. And you pop coal into an engine, and then it would do mechanical work to lift something or move something. In the case of civilization, we aren't trying to lift some external object. When we consume energy to do work for ourselves. So it's a slightly different heat engine than is a normal conception. Here there's a feedback loop. If we consume energy and do work with that energy, that work is done to enable us to consume more energy in the future. So there's a feedback that leads to growth in this situation, rather than just simply work being done on some external agency.
And meanwhile, our politicians continue to call us back to a growing GDP. That sounds like our carbon emissions will never really go down if that happens.
Well, in fact, if it's a growing GDP, that not only corresponds to accelerating growth of carbon dioxide emissions, but actually an interesting mathematical form, which is super exponential growth. So it's not just exponential growth, but it is the exponent of an exponent. So emissions are not only accelerating, but the rate of growth is accelerating as well. And that's just an unavoidable consequence of a growing GDP.
And that's pretty believable when we hear about what's happening in China and India and all around the world.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's always a constant surprise. You see reports where the people who are measuring the CO2 are constantly surprised that CO2 emissions rates have continued to accelerate even when the scientists are hearing dire economic forecasts.
This is Radio Ecoshock. I'm Alex Smith with scientist Tim Garrett from the University of Utah, and we're about to explore whether economic collapse is the best way to save the biosphere, because we've talked about nuclear power. We need a new atomic plant every day, and that doesn't seem likely in time to avert catastrophic climate disruption, in my opinion. So that leaves economic collapse, and some deep greens, as you know, Tim, have called for this, but you're among the first academics that I know of to publish a peer-reviewed paper saying collapse may be necessary to save a habitable planet. Or am I putting words in your mouth? Maybe you didn't say quite that.
Well, not quite that, but that's what I did say is that if we are to ever stabilize emissions, that necessitates rather unpalatable, let's say, economic implications. If we are just to stabilize emissions, and I think this is a bit counterintuitive at first, but if we were just to stabilize the emissions, not so that they're decreasing, but just to stabilize them, the economy would have to be zero, adjusted for inflation. That does not mean that there wouldn't be economic activities going on, simply that none of these economic activities would add to the value of civilization. They would always be compensated for by some inflationary pressure. Now, I don't know what that world would look like. I've never lived in a world like that, but perhaps we can imagine by looking at some recent situations in places like Zimbabwe, where they ended up with hyperinflation, and it was a very different sort of life than we are used to ourselves in North America.
And so you looked at past development of civilization and applied your formula. Can you take the same formula and try and measure out how deep and how bad this collapse would have to be? I guess you've sort of expressed it right now, but could you enlarge on that, on what it would take to bring our carbon back to, say, 350? Can we figure that out?
Wow, offhand, that I did run this once, and with some extremely drastic scenarios, I was able to see the model settle out at about 450 parts per million. But that would mean virtual complete economic collapse within my lifetime. I cannot imagine how it would be possible to get down to 350 parts per million. It seems implausible.
I gather it was hard to get this paper published until it came out in late 2009. What has been the reaction so far?
Well, the reaction I've got there's been a fair bit of interest from people, interestingly enough, who are proponents of the peak oil theory. So for the peak oil fans, of course, finding some sort of basic link between the economy and rates of energy consumption is a very useful thing, because then they can relate it to their own understanding of the size and depletion rates of geological reservoirs of oil. Oh, it's heartening. I mean, it's nice to have when someone's interested in it. And other colleagues have found some interest, too, in just the basic thermodynamic framework. I think a lot of people have long had a suspicion that statements that increasing energy efficiency will lead to reduced energy consumption are, well, something's quite obviously wrong with that, because it runs counter to our experience. We've been increasing energy efficiency throughout history. And
yes, you mentioned Jevons' law, I believe it was?
Yeah, Jevons' paradox, that's it. Yeah, I mean, Jevons was an interesting guy. He was extremely insightful, I think a bit too serious for his own good. He died at a early age, I think, because he stressed himself out worrying about things. But yeah, he had this very insightful comment about the introduction of the steam engine, James Watt's steam engine in the late 1800s, and he was saying this was, a major efficiency gain, and it led to increased coal consumption rather than less coal consumption. And he made a very emphatic argument that any argument to the contrary was completely wrong.
And as I learned from your website, your real specialty is clouds. And listeners, you can find that link, as I say, to Tim Garrett's website and the Radio Ecoshock blog. In my opinion, Tim, clouds are one of the last great frontiers of unknown science. Do you foresee a time when humans could control the clouds? And if so, should we?
There's actually a history to trying to control clouds, and even today people try to engage in something called cloud seeding, where they try to add silver iodide pellets to clouds in the attempt to accelerate their production of rain. Of course, this has agricultural benefits, and actually the field started out of military interest. And it's been largely discredited simply because the amount of energy in a cloud is immense. It's something like many nuclear bombs going off at once. It's a huge amount of energy. You could power all of civilization if you could harness the energy off a few big clouds. So to imagine that we can control clouds seems a bit fanciful to me. And I know there are people who talk about it, but I'm highly skeptical.
Well, some have mentioned it as a form of geoengineering, as an alternative way to control the heat that reaches the Earth, but you don't really see a future for that in the near term.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my research is based on the ideas that these people are proposing, which are that if we add aerosol to clouds, then that will make them brighter and reflect more sunlight. And my belief is that we may make the cloud brighter here, but that would necessitate things becoming darker somewhere else, and that it would all be a wash once you consider the planet as a whole.
Tim, I'm personally very resistant to recommending collapse as a solution. Billions of people would be hurt, and likely many would die, and I'm enjoying our civilization, including talking to you right now long distance. So how do you personally handle the ugly possibility that we may be at peak wealth right now with a downhill ride ahead of us?
Yeah, well, I have 2 young children, so it's on my mind. We're along for the ride. We will see what happens, and in the meantime, I guess I figure enjoy life while we can.
What are you working on now, and what would you like to research in the future?
Well, right now I'm about to submit a paper on how the Arctic becomes polluted and how clouds remove pollution from the Arctic. But I would like to pursue more of this research on the thermodynamics of complex systems. I've applied this to all of civilization, and right now I would like to use the same sort of framework to understand the development, growth, and death of clouds. I think the same principles can be applied, whether it's to civilization, to clouds, to a child, or whatever it is. We all live and die by the first and second laws of thermodynamics, so these principles should be quite general.
It might be interesting to apply it to cities as well, since most of us are living in cities and there are huge thermodynamic flows happening in cities themselves.
That hasn't been done quite from a thermodynamic standpoint, but it has been from a mathematical standpoint. And in fact, when I mentioned earlier the concept of super exponential growth, there has been a recent paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy, well, I guess it's 2 or 3 years old now, that highlighted super exponential growth being one of the defining characteristics of successful cities.
This is Radio Ecoshock. Our guest is Dr. Tim Garrett from the University of Utah. Find this interview as a free MP3 download at our website, ecoshock.org. I'm Alex Smith. Thanks for being with us. You are listening to the best of Radio Ecoshock as I put out the key interviews from years of chasing down the truth about the truth. Stay tuned for more. Hello, I'm Alex Smith with a serious question for you. What if the past determines our future? Are we humans headed for success or lasting economic depression, perhaps on an overheated planet? Dr. Timothy Garrett is Associate Professor of Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Utah. In February 2010, Tim joined us on Radio Ecoshock to discuss his disturbing new scientific paper. It outlined a direct relationship between the energy we burn, the wealth we create, and the growth of greenhouse gas emissions. Now he's gone a step further with some new work, so Dr. Tim Garrett, welcome back to Radio Ecoshock.
Thanks for having me.
I think we should start with your original formula for energy and wealth. Can you take a shot at explaining that for the intelligent listener?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it really started just as a simple query as to where the economic value comes from. And, coming from a physics background and being really totally naive in economics, I thought, well, maybe it has something to do with the rate of energy consumption by civilization. In other words, perhaps that our wealth, the wealth of civilization, has a direct link to how much energy we can consume. To me, that seemed like a reasonable assumption, because in order for us to do anything, which I suppose is perhaps a measure of our wealth, we need to consume energy. That's a basic law of the physical universe. It is through energy transformations that anything happens. And so what I tried to do was just simply look at this using some available data. And it turned out that this relationship is in fact fixed, that there is a constant relationship of about 10 milliwatts that is required to support every inflation-adjusted $1990 of economic value. And that was the core result of the first paper I did into this. And what I tried to do was go from there to see what this implied for subjects such as global warming, which are closer to my primary field of research in atmospheric sciences.
Well, based on everything we know so far, if we grow the economy, as every politician promises, we'll put more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But what if the economy crashes? Will we put less up there, or will we reach safe levels if we have a severe downturn? Well,
this is where my work differed slightly from perhaps what other people are thinking. Now, the way I define wealth is that it is the accumulation of our past production of economic value. So what we have today is an accumulation of what we've been able to do in the past. Now, when you talk about the economy declining, well, usually what people think about is they think about GDP going down, the gross world product declining with time. And what I showed was that if the GDP declines with time, which is ordinarily what we would think of as being a depression, this would not, in fact, correspond to lower carbon dioxide emissions. In fact, carbon dioxide emissions would need to grow. Instead, in order for carbon dioxide emissions to go down, what would be required is effectively a complete collapse of the economy. A collapse in the sense that the gross world product would have to be almost completely offset by inflation. So that, in some sense, it would seem strange to an economist to think about this, but in some sense, the global product would have to be negative rather than positive. In other words, we'd have to be in a situation of net consumption rather than net production. We are consuming more of what we have produced in the past rather than producing new, increasing wealth. So that's a rather extreme situation, but this is what the data bears out as being required to have lower carbon dioxide emissions.
So if I understand it correctly, your definition of wealth does not include the sort of fantasy money that, like the quantitative easing from the U.S. Federal Reserve, but it includes everything that humans have produced that's still here from the beginning of time. I mean, even the Pantheon in Rome would be part of our accumulated wealth at this point.
Yes, yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, I part of my wealth is my house, but the house was produced back in 1926.
And you have a new paper submitted to the journal Climatic Change, and the title is On the Coupled Evolution of Inflation, Wealth, and Atmospheric Concentrations of Carbon Dioxide. And you do go a step further here, predicting, it seems to me, almost the worst of all worlds, high levels of greenhouse gases and inflation. I still don't really get what inflation has to do with climate change.
I was actually just down in New Orleans for a scientific meeting, and I spent some time after that with my family. And we went to some local museums, and of course in New Orleans, there's the lasting legacy of the Hurricane Katrina disaster. And with Katrina, as it was with, perhaps all natural disasters are, historically, they've been inflationary. What they do is they destroy past production while people perhaps still have the dollars in their pockets, but there are fewer things available for their dollars to be matched to. So the cost of what is present, as it goes up in cost. Now, this wasn't actually how I approached it in the paper, but I think this was how an economist would normally approach the topic. The way I approached it in the paper was that I showed that environmental destruction, whether it's by disease or by weather or whatever it is effectively a decay on our past production that devalues what we have, and that is effectively an inflationary pressure. Now, what you can think about global warming being is, in some sense, it's like a long-term natural disaster. It is not only a long-term natural disaster that happens continuously, unlike Katrina, which was momentarily, but it also happens globally. So with Katrina, it was instantaneous, effectively instantaneous, and they caused a short-term inflation. But then people were able to come in from outside and provide new resources that stabilized the New Orleans economy. Now, I was in New Orleans, things were expensive still, but, it wasn't out of this world. But in a future world, you can imagine, now this is slightly speculative, but it's consistent with what you would expect from the physics. You could imagine that there is an ever-increasing environmental pressure on civilization that continually acts as an ever-stronger force that eats away at what we have produced in the past. And this will be an inflationary pressure that cannot be supplanted by outside resources from outside, because it is acting globally. It will be affecting everybody.
Right. If we have rising seas, for example, eating up some of our best farmland or salinating it, you can't make some more land like that. It's gone.
Exactly.
So that pushes up the price of all the remaining land, and that's how climate change can create inflation, for example.
Yes.
This is Radio Ecoshock. I'm Alex Smith with Dr. Timothy Garrett, an atmospheric scientist from the University of Utah. And I'd like to really get to the conclusions of your new paper. Based on our past records of energy use and wealth, what does your model show as possible futures?
Well, in fact, this was actually stimulated by our past conversation. In my first study, I showed that carbon dioxide emissions and wealth were intrinsically coupled. Without actually decarbonizing the economy, like switching to renewables or nuclear power at an extraordinarily fast rate, you cannot have wealth without having carbon dioxide emissions. The two go together. And in fact, since 1970, the relationship between the two has been very, very tightly fixed. Now, that would seem to have implications for the future because carbon dioxide emissions accumulate in the atmosphere. As carbon dioxide emissions accumulate in the atmosphere, some fraction goes into what we call sinks in the oceans and the land, but about half of what we emit accumulates in the atmosphere. That is going to create an ever-increasing pressure on civilization. Now, by eating away at civilization wealth, global warming will actually reduce our capacity to emit carbon dioxide. So there's actually what you would call in physics a negative feedback. So our wealth is emitting CO2. CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere and then feeds back on our capacity to produce new wealth. Eventually, one could imagine that civilization would enter into a phase of collapse because the carbon dioxide levels are so high that we're simply unable to produce new goods without them being destroyed by global warming. And at that point, perhaps emissions would go down, and eventually, if civilization collapsed fast enough, then perhaps carbon dioxide concentrations would be stabilized. Now, you asked me last time what would be required to keep carbon dioxide concentrations at 450 parts per million. And that's normally what's considered to be about a dangerous level by, let's say, during the Copenhagen Accord. And I made a guess that it would require actually flat-out civilization collapse, and based on some preliminary work I did, and then I decided to look into this a bit more deeply, and I actually wrote a second paper where it turns out that is true. Not only would we have to have civilization collapse starting very, very soon, like within the next decade or so, but we would also have to have extremely rapid decarbonization in order to keep carbon dioxide levels below, let's say, 500 parts per million, twice pre-industrial levels. In order to keep them below 1,000, well, without civilization collapse, let's say we have continuing health, let's say that the civilization is very resilient to global warming, then carbon dioxide levels are going to go extremely high by the end of the century, probably above 1,000 parts per million. If you think about 1,000 parts per million, well, that's probably, depends on what the climate sensitivity is, but that's something along the lines of 5 degrees Celsius warming at least. And when we think of 5 degrees Celsius warming, people are familiar with this, usually start bringing up highly catastrophic scenarios. So in some sense, it's hard to imagine how civilization cannot be in pretty dire straits during this century.
Well, I hear people suggesting that we could make a big cut in carbon emissions just with energy efficiency. We'll all get electric cars and we'll put in the light bulbs. And I've heard that you don't think so much about energy efficiency as a way to save ourselves.
Well, actually, it's almost counterintuitive, but no, in fact, it's the other way around. The whole reason that civilization has been so successful and has grown so quickly is that we are energy efficient. It is our efficiency of taking material goods and energy and converting them into production and net growth that actually leads to us producing carbon dioxide. The increasingly efficient we become, the more efficient we become at growing civilization and its wealth. I think this is actually common sense. I mean, we always strive for efficiency because we have some underlying sense that efficiency is good for our general well-being. But our general well-being is normally measured in terms of economic wealth. And as I showed, economic wealth has a direct correspondence to carbon dioxide emissions. So increasing energy efficiency leads to more energy consumption, and more energy consumption leads to more carbon dioxide emissions. And I'm not the first person to say this. This has actually been pointed out by energy economists ever since the late 1800s. So I'm not sure why it's not more generally accepted today.
You know, the study of economy has been called the dismal science, and your paper might qualify for that title. The abstract reads, "There are no plausible thermodynamically supported solutions that avoid inflation rates less than 100% and lead to stabilized atmospheric CO2 concentrations within this century." To me, that says we either get worthless money or a dangerous atmosphere or both. Are these our choices?
I don't see any other options. I mean, I suppose what you could argue is that civilization could decarbonize, switch to renewables and nuclear power at such an extraordinarily fast rate that in some sense we decouple ourselves from the atmosphere. So in other words, we are able to keep consuming energy without affecting atmospheric composition. But even there's actually, I mean, in some sense it's rather amusing, well, it's intellectually amusing at least, that decarbonizing civilization will actually not be as effective as
one might expect. Now, decarbonizing civilization, let's say we were to do this proactively, presumably it would cost money, and we would only do it with the expectation that it would help alleviate the worst damages of global warming. And I think that makes sense. Why would we do it otherwise? We would put in the effort because it will benefit us in the long run. But remember, anything that benefits us in the long run is effectively measurable as an increase in our wealth. And an increase in our wealth will translate to an increase in energy consumption. So, in essence, what happens is decarbonizing promotes our wealth and our energy consumption in the future. But increasing our energy consumption, as long as we are partly a fossil fuel economy, will correspond to increasing fossil fuel carbon dioxide emissions. So this doesn't completely offset the decarbonization gains, but because it promotes society health, we actually do not gain as much from decarbonizing as one might initially expect, because it's a dynamic system, and we would actually continue to grow faster than we would otherwise.
I can see it. I mean, if we build a lot of nuclear power plants, it's going to take some carbon shovels to get all that cement going, and all the materials still have to be brought out. We're going to use oil to do it, and so there might actually be a burst of new emissions just trying to do that.
Well, yeah, there's that too, yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, recently I recorded a speech by the former Whole Earth catalog guru Stuart Brand. He calls for an all-out effort to geoengineer the planet to stave off a climate disaster. He likes the idea of making clouds brighter by shooting seawater into them. That's supposed to reflect more sunlight, hoping to cool the Earth. You are a scientist with expertise in clouds. What do you think about that?
I'm quite skeptical that would work. I mean, geoengineering is, in some sense, it may be a question not whether we should do it, but perhaps when we will do it. Because one could imagine that civilization will always try to do whatever it can to optimize its capacity to grow. But with regards to brightening clouds, well, that's been suggested as perhaps a viable way of doing it. One popular way that's been suggested is to produce lots of sea spray from some fancy ships. This sea spray goes up into the clouds, and that makes them brighter because if there are lots of small aerosol particles, these sea salt particles, then there will be more droplets in the clouds and also smaller droplets. And that has two effects. One is that, for some reasons I won't describe, it makes the clouds brighter. Just by having a large number of small droplets, you have brighter clouds and clouds that have a small number of large droplets. But it also tends to shut off precipitation in the clouds. And because precipitation is a sink, it's a means for losing water from clouds, it has been argued that the clouds will have longer lifetimes and therefore reflect more sunlight to space for a longer period of time, and because they're brighter, they'll reflect more. These ideas have been around since the 1970s and 1980s, and it has since become apparent to a lot of researchers in this area that the effect is not nearly as strong as one might initially expect. There are all sorts of, again, negative feedbacks. And these negative feedbacks often act to entirely erase the brightening effect that you might expect from these aerosols going into the clouds. I mean, just to give one example, the clouds that would be targeted are these large sheets of stratus clouds and stratocumulus clouds that are off the western coasts of continents. So where you are, I guess you're in Vancouver, are you? You're probably very familiar with low-level clouds. I used to live in Seattle, and it was, in Seattle, the entire winter was covered with this large deck of low-level clouds. Now, these clouds, if we brighten them, then they tend to be over the ocean. If we brighten them, then less solar radiation comes in to heat up the surface. And it is warming of the surface that enables the fluxes of moisture and heat from the oceans and the surface upwards into the atmosphere that enable the clouds to form in the first place. So let's say the clouds become brighter, they cool the surface, then there's less flux of heat and moisture to form the clouds, and then the clouds dissipate. So it could be that adding aerosols to clouds does not make them brighter and more long-lived, but actually shorter-lived and darker.
you're kind of a troublemaker in a way here. Because we've got a lot of people who are looking for a realistic way out of this awful dilemma, and you've got a really sharp mind that it seems to be you can stick some pins in the balloon and away it goes. But I guess that really is what science is about. I mean, we're looking for what is real and what works and what doesn't.
Oh, of course. I mean, these are interesting physics problems, and I mean, one of the privileges of being a university scientist is, of course, that you get to think about these problems for the simple joy of thinking about them. And if the answers end up one way or rather than the other, well, so be it. I mean, it's the joys in trying to figure something out. Yeah, I mean, that's for me, that was the fun of doing the economics problem. I mean, I have no background in economics, but I am as much a player as anybody else in the economic system. And wouldn't it be fun if it is possible to understand the economic system using the tools that, I, as a physicist, understand from my research in doing clouds.
Thank you so much for sharing your time with us, Tim
Thank
Garrett.
you very much.
I'm Alex Smith for Radio Ecoshock.